That's why many scientists, including Professor Stephen Hawking, come out with statements like this: given the vast number of Earth-like planets outside the solar system, on purely statistical grounds, life almost certainly exists somewhere else. Well, with all due respect to Professor Hawking and the other scientists, I have to say I personally completely disagree with that analysis, and I'll explain why, but a bit later on. First of all, alien life. What are the chances? Well, for anything, we need to find some evidence. So, you may have heard of a guy called Peter Altman, who wrote a book called Chariots of the Gods. You can still buy it on Amazon, and you can get it for nothing for your Kindle. It's actually worth the read. It's interesting. And his main thesis was that our ancestors were too stupid to have done things like move the Easter Island statues or build other large monuments, and they just didn't have the technology to do it. And the various photographs and illustrations in his book. So we can look at a couple of them. These are some cave drawings from a 10,000-year-old cave in Italy. And von Däniken says, well, these are just drawings of floating astronauts. And, you know, you've got to be honest, they do look like floating astronauts, particularly if you adjust the angles to match, which I've done here. What it doesn't go into, though, is that astronauts do float at about 200 miles above the Earth's surface at 18,000 miles an hour. So it's a bit unusual to try and imagine how our ancestors would have been able to see them and draw them. Easter Island, I don't know if you've ever been there, it really is a great place. And another thing in the book is about these statues. They weigh hundreds of tons. So how could primitive people, never mind carving them, actually move them all around the island? And there is actually a legend on the island that says the statues walked to their final resting place. Well, I found this video on YouTube. So what's happened here is that these people have built a replica. They've attached some string or rope or chain, and from each side, you can't see the people on the right, but they pull it in order, and the thing actually moves. It's walking. So, you know, there you go. And Carl Sagan, he was very dismissive of von Däniken, but writing as careless as von Däniken's, whose principal thesis is that our ancestors were dummies, should be so popular as a sober commentary on the credulousness of our times. So, you know, that's what he thinks. So I don't think anything in von Däniken's book can be classed as evidence for the presence of aliens. It just isn't good enough. Unidentified flying objects, well, thousands of these things have been reported over the years, possibly starting with Kenneth Arnold, who was the pilot. And on June 1947, he reported seeing 9 objects flying ahead of him at about 1,200 miles an hour, as if they were saucers skimming over water. But notice the headline, supersonic flying saucers. We didn't say they were shaped like saucers, this is just the way they seem to be moving. And some people think this is where the term flying saucers actually came from. What they were, who knows? But at twice the speed of sound, he did well to see any detail there at all flying his light aircraft. If you saw this, you could be forgiven for thinking that you had seen a flying saucer. It's actually a lenticular cloud, a lens-shaped cloud, and these form under certain atmospheric conditions. This was in the paper a couple of weeks ago, one of these clouds over a mountaintop. And again, you might think this is some sort of alien craft, but it's not. This is a painting of some German soldiers admiring a circular flying craft. I couldn't find out whether this thing was ever actually built and flew, but someone decided that it was worthy of a painting. But what was made and did fly was this thing. It's called the VZ9 Avro car. It was made by the US Air Force in the late 1950s, and the idea was, and you can see here, the thing does fly, but we don't need all this. It was very unstable and was never developed any further. Two of them were built, I think one's in a museum somewhere. But it turns out a circular shape isn't a good idea for a flying object, for a flying saucer. The Roswell incident, that's probably the most famous of all the UFO sightings and things. 1947, the Roswell, which is in New Mexico, the Roswell Army airfield has captured a flying saucer. Something fell out of the sky, and the initial reports that it was some sort of disc. That was then afterwards changed to a weather balloon. What people, I think the most credulous explanation of that is that the Americans were experimenting with some aircraft before the beginnings of the Cold War, and they didn't want people to know what it was, so they were quite happy when people thought it was a flying saucer. But the thing has endured. There's a UFO museum, and there's a stage of a surgeon and someone else doing an autopsy on an alien creature. And there is actually something called the alien autopsy, and if you look on YouTube, you can see it. So this is a black and white film showing two surgeons clad in hazard gear doing rather horrible things to whatever is lying on the table. So I belong to the Magic Circle, and a few years ago we had a guy there called Spiros Malaris, who is a magician and various other things that he does, and that's him lying on the far side of this alien creature. And he said this whole thing was an illusion, started off as a joke, but then it really got legs and went around the world, that all the things were props, they were made, they weren't real. So there's a legend that has grown up around this. Many people still think it was real and the US government are hiding it. He gave a really interesting talk and explained how it was all done. Having said all that, much more recently, this is a photograph taken from the fighter plane of the American Air Force, and they've seen lots of pilots, seen lots of things like this. To me it looks like a bit of bird poo on the windscreen, but who knows? They've followed it by radar, and the government were serious enough about investigating it. It made Fox News, and last year the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, they published a preliminary assessment of what they called unidentified aerial phenomena. And their conclusion was, we don't know what they are. So, there you go. So, evidence for UFOs? I don't think so. Now, what about contact? There are people who say, well, I've actually met an alien. Well, if that was true, I mean, you can't get better evidence than that. So this guy, George Adamski, he was a Polish-American, good-looking guy, was a film star. And he attained huge popularity in the 1950s. And this is probably his most famous photograph. This is supposed to be spacecraft from Venus. And I was out shopping with my wife a few weeks ago, and I was in Aldi, we were in Aldi, and I saw this, I took a quick picture of it. And, you know, it ain't that different, is it? If I bought one, I should have bought one, angled it a bit, stuck a couple of ping pong balls underneath, a few markers on it, and you have a perfect replica. Anyway, he's written a book called Flying Saucers Have Landed. Again, you can still buy this on Amazon. It's worth a read, perhaps. Unfortunately, his camera didn't work when he was taken on board the spacecraft. That's a real shame. Apparently, the high magnetic fields interfered with the Polaroid process. Fortunately, though, he did arrange to meet his Venusian friend. Next, what on there? in the desert in California. But obviously, looking at the drawing, he forgot his camera. That's a shame, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the 1950s, not much was known about the surface conditions of other planets. So this very thin, human-looking guy would have had to survive on a surface temperature hot enough to melt lead, nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius, and an atmospheric pressure which would require you to be wearing a full, hard diving suit. Oh.
Oh, yeah.
So Betty and Barney Hill, this couple were driving home in New Hampshire from a holiday, and they got a bit tired on the journey, so they stopped somewhere where they saw some lights in the background, and then things got a bit fuzzy for them. But the story that later emerged was that Betty Hill was taken on board this spacecraft, and alien cat-like creatures showed her around, took some tissue samples, and then let her go. Before she left, she asked if she could take some souvenirs, but of course that was denied. Some years later, she underwent hypnosis, and she came up with this, which she says was a star map, which she saw on the side, inside the spacecraft. Well, on its own, it doesn't mean anything at all, but it was published, and an amateur astronomer called Marjorie Fish wondered if what Betty Hill had drawn there actually bore some resemblance to a real star field somewhere. So she looked around, and she came up with this. Now, these are real stars, and again, you've got to admit, that is pretty similar, isn't it? Now, how could Betty Hill have drawn, and some of those stars weren't even catalogued when the abduction took place. So how could she draw that, which actually represented some real stars? Well, as always is always the case, I think, there's always more than one explanation. So Carl Sagan came up with this. So what I've done here, there are 15 dots in each of those in A and 15 dots in B, and they're supposed to represent stars. And I think you'll agree that they're both random, they don't look anything like each other. But if you connect up selected ones with lines, if you've got enough of them, you can make similar patterns. And that's what's happened here. Why is that doing it on its own? So, given enough, you can ignore some and use others to make the pattern you want. And that's the explanation of how that was done. And eventually Marjorie Fish withdrew her conclusion, saying that it doesn't make any sense. But the state of New Hampshire were proud enough of this to erect this plaque here. This was the first widely reported UFO abduction report in the United States. Well, any evidence there? No, this is just talk and hearsay. So what we really want is some physical evidence. Let's get something in our hands that we can look at and analyse. You know, when the Apollo went to the moon, they left a plaque. When NASA launched Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, that is obviously a manufactured object, and they attached a plaque to it to try and give some information as to where it came from and how long ago. But we've got nothing like that. I mean, plenty of people said they've seen flying saucers. Some of them have drawn them, some of them have photographed them, but no one's ever found one. So until that happens, in my book, there's just no evidence for them that is credible. People have been searching for alien life rather than just waiting for it to come to us. And the best known way has been listening for radio signals. This is Frank Drake, who started the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in 1961. this is the radio telescope at West Bank in Virginia, and it came up with this equation, the Drake equation. It doesn't matter what all the symbols and things mean. The basic like aliens. Hello.
Aliens. Sorry.
The basic idea is that can you calculate the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy? Well, there's certain things you need to know. How many stars are there? Well, you can estimate that. The fraction of stars suitable for life, with the right sort of radiation. Hard to say, I would think. The fraction of suitable stars with planets, well, we've got a fair idea of that. The average number of habitable planets per solar system, no idea really, even though I put a green tick to it. But the last four, how many of which does life develop, does intelligence develop, which try to communicate, and how long does civilization last? No idea at all. Your estimate could be in error by 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. And to get the answer to this, you have to multiply these things together. So even if each one is in error by just 1 in 100, and it's going to be a lot more than that, you've got 10 to the error of 1 10 to the 8, nearly a billion. So the other way around, in 2008, from the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico, which has sadly now been damaged, a message was sent to a planet called Gliese 581c, which is 21 light years away. So it'll get there in 2029. If there's a reply and it's sent pretty quickly, we'll get it in 2050. I'll be 109 then, so I don't think I'll be around, but maybe some of you will. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And this was a report in the paper not that long ago. We don't have to read it all. What happened was that some astronomers announced the discovery of a planet in another galaxy, the Whirlpool galaxy M51A. It's the first time a planet has been discovered in another galaxy. When I say discovered, it's the transit method where when the planet goes around its sun, the light from the sun dims. And after you've watched that a few times, and it always dims at the same sort of time with the same amount, then as far as the NASA Kepler telescope is concerned, that's a confirmed sighting of a planet. This particular planet apparently goes around its sun once every 70 years. So that's a long way for it to happen again. So it's a tentative discovery. The interesting thing is, it's 28 million light years away. So assuming that there is an alien civilization there, and assuming that they've developed some super duper telescope, and they're looking at Earth as a potential habitat for alien life as far as they're concerned, this is what they see. These things are called Paraceratherians. They are enormous rhinoceros-like, now extinct creatures. And they probably think, well, if that's what it's like, we're not going to bother going there. Spacecraft visitations. Well, spacecraft have now been sent to every planet and many moons in our solar system. And they've sent back great photographs, but so far there's no evidence of life. Yes, some of them, like some of the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn, probably contain large oceans underneath the exterior ice. Those could be habitats for life, but there's no evidence for it. NASA has been searching for evidence of life on Mars for many years, and nothing's has come up yet. Now this is an interesting concept, biosignatures. So if a compound is detected in the atmosphere, the surface of a planet or moon, if it is only produced by biological processes, that is life, and not produced by natural processes that would occur on inorganic material, then that might be an indicator of some living organisms. And you may have read about the potential, or the possible discovery of phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus a few years ago. Well, phosphine can be produced without life, but it's not easy to do. And it turns out that the circumstances in the atmosphere of Venus are not conducive for the natural production of phosphine. But otherwise, it is produced by living creatures. So the thought was, well, this could be an indication of some sort of life forms in the atmosphere of Venus. I'm not sure that this discovery is still credited as being positive. One would need to send a probe there just to look for it. But it was an interesting discovery. So I don't think either that we've got any evidence that there is life on other planets at the moment. This is something I came across. They're called epsilon machines. Well, they're not machines, they're computer algorithms. The word machine derives from the early computers, which were machines. And epsilon's got something to do with the sort of mathematical analysis that's done. So the title of the paper, which was in Nature Astronomy, Assessing Planetary Complexity and Potential Agnostic Biosignatures Using Epsilon Machines. So what that all means, if you think of a desert, that's a pretty flat, featureless, unchanging surface. It's not what you call complex. Whereas a civilization, this surface, there are all sorts of things going on. There are different colours, different buildings, different textures, different subjects, different substances. So that is a complex surface. So what this algorithm does, it measures the complexity of the surface, and if it turns out to be complex, that could be an indication of some sort of living processes that are constantly changing the surface. And I actually had an email correspondence with the author of this paper, who's in California, and they're just, this topic, this procedure has been used for many years, but they're the first people to try and apply it to planetary surfaces, and they're working on a system for having a look at Mars. So interesting idea, hasn't come up with any data yet, but interesting idea. So, what are the chances? Well, if you're playing roulette, you know that 36 numbers and a 0. So the chance of getting the right number is 1 in 37. I mean, that's completely straightforward. If you do the lottery, you've got a 1 in 45 million chance of getting the 6 full numbers correct. Again, it's pure maths, easy to work out. I like to try and find analogies in everyday life to sort of explain scientific things if I can. So I don't know how good an analogy this is, but I came up with this idea. So there are about 8 billion people in the world. So what are the chances that someone in the world, somewhere, is wearing exactly the same outfit as I am now? Well, shoes, socks, pants, trousers, belt, shirt, glasses, watch. So there's 8 things there. Now I have no idea how many different versions of each of these items there are. But I made a guess at 100,000 styles. There are probably a lot more, but it's a guess. So there's 100,000 different types of shoes. So if 8 things, there are 10 to the 40 possible different outfits, if that first number is correct. There are just under 10 to the power of 10 people in the world. So the chances of 2 people with identical outfits is about 1 in 10 to the power of 30. So it's possible, but it's very, very unlikely. And it's no good saying, because there are billions of people in the world, it's almost certain that some 2 people are wearing the same thing, which is what Hawking and other people have said. Because there are so many planets in the universe, there's a good chance that life, which obviously can exist because here we are, has happened before. That was that number again. So this is a little video here. Let's see if the sound works.
Okay, now it's time for a little game of dice.
So, my point here is that if you don't know how to calculate the odds, you can't say anything about how likely something is. With roulette, we know exactly how to calculate the odds. With the lottery, we know exactly how to calculate the odds. With my clothes analogy, we don't really know, but we can make sort of an educated guess at the lower end. But with life, we have no idea, because we don't know what the conditions were for life to have originated on Earth. A lot of things would have had to have been exactly right. A large moon, the right distance from the sun, right type of radiation from the sun, the right temperature, the right atmosphere, all sorts of things that we don't know about. So you can't even make an educated guess as to how likely it was that life has arisen here. And because of that, you can't say that because there may be 10 to the power of 22 planets in the universe, that's enough for it to have happened again. I'm not saying it hasn't, but I don't think you're entitled to say that it has. So if you don't have information to work out the chance of something happening, you can say nothing about its likelihood. And because you didn't know how many sides the dice has, you can't say how likely it was to throw a particular number. So this is Stephen Hawking's statement again, and that's why I disagree with it. So, what are the chances? Personally, I think there's no credible evidence, and in the absence of that, oh, yes, the Fermi paradox. The other thing is that if there is life somewhere else, and if it's common, then it's likely that some of it may be thousands, millions, billions of years ahead of ours, because the sun could be that much older, their sun could be that much older than our sun. If that's the case, well, where is everybody? Why has nobody made contact with us and left some credible evidence of their existence? So what are the chances? In my opinion, this guy just doesn't exist.